Hello, and welcome to the Speculative Fiction Writing Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Heather Davis. I'm a book coach, developmental editor, founder of the World Shift Writing Summit, and fellow storyteller. And this is the show that's all about how to brainstorm, write, edit, publish, and sell a powerful speculative fiction novel. And maybe just change the world too. And today I am super excited to be talking to J.D. Barker. Barker is a New York Times and international best-selling American author whose work has been broadly described as suspense thrillers incorporating elements of horror, crime, mystery, science fiction, and the supernatural. His books have been translated into 24 languages, sold in more than 150 countries, and optioned for both film and television. He has also collaborated on several high-profile co-authored thrillers. Barker's gripping storytelling and genre-bending style have earned him a global readership. JD, thank you so much for being on the show today. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my absolute pleasure. So to start off, just in case there's anyone out there who isn't familiar with you and hasn't read your work, can you tell us a little bit about your work and what you write and who you are?
Yeah, so I'll try to give you the short version. So I came up in this world as a book doctor and a ghostwriter. So writing was one of those things I was always good at, but my mom always told me writing is a great hobby, but you can't make a living at it. You have to get a real job. So I followed mom's advice and I went off to college and I got a couple of degrees. I ended up working in finance, but I would come home and I would write at night to stay sane. And I started that way back when I was in college, just working with other people, and basically created a side hustle as what I called a book doctor. So people would give me manuscripts. I would help tweak them. I would tell them what's working, what's not working, fix this, delete this, your dialogue is terrible, whatever it was. Like I would help them clean it up. And I did that for 23 years while I was in the corporate world. And over that time frame, I had 6 different books that hit the New York Times list that all came out with other people's names on the cover. And some of those I had essentially written as a ghostwriter. So that gets very frustrating after a while. So my wife pulled me aside and she said, listen, I know you want to become a full-time author. Let's figure out a way to make this happen. And I was 43 when we had this conversation. And we were kind of stuck because I was a chief compliance officer at a brokerage firm, which is a horrible job. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. But the salary was nice. I had a huge salary, nice bonuses, and we had the trappings of that. We had a big house, we had cars, we had a boat. So we had an expensive lifestyle that we couldn't just pick up and walk away from. We had a monthly nut that was like $10,000 to $12,000. So we had to support that. She came up with this crazy plan. We sold everything that we owned. We bought a tiny little duplex in Pittsburgh for cash. We rented out one side to some tenants and we moved into the other side. And basically got to the point where I could quit the day job and, live off of savings long enough to write that first book. And I remember the day she sat me down at the dining room table, which was very small, and showed me the bank statement. She's like, I think you got about 18 months to make this writer thing work before you have to go back to, and get a job. Go. And, that was around 2012, 2013. And I just kind of hit the ground running and wrote my first novel.
Was there ever a time when you sold everything and moved into this duplex when you thought, I'm crazy. This was a crazy thing to do. I shouldn't have done this. Or were you always just really confident that you were going to make it work?
No, like literally the entire time I was second guessing it because even though I hated the job that I had, it paid really good. I had a good 401k, like we were setting ourselves up for retirement, healthcare was strong. And like we literally threw all of that away, in order to do this. And, like you don't write a book overnight. Like it took me 6 months to write that book. And even for me, I had spent so many years working with other people, basically collaborating on other projects. This was actually the first time I sat down and wrote a book, completely on my own. So that was a very weird experience. I ended up indie publishing the first title, and got really lucky. I sold a lot of copies, and that put me on the radar of the traditional guys. So when I queried my second book, which was The Fourth Monkey, had no trouble getting an agent. And the book, at first, she started shopping it. And I don't know if you've ever gone through this process, but, they mail your manuscript out to, 20, 30, 40, 100 different editors or whatever. And, you get the first rejections right away and then things go quiet for a little while and then more come in and more come in. And, you see a lot more rejections than you do, we're going to, interest in the book. So like it is a really, a negative experience. So we're living in this duplex while this is going on, and I'm second guessing all of this stuff. And I go for a run every day, and I was out on a run. And my agent called me and she said, I don't know what shifted, but we just got a preemptive offer out of the UK for, I think it was like $150,000 or $160,000. And, preemptive offer is basically multiple publishers want the book. And one publisher just kind of steps in and says, we're going to give you this amount of money, just to take it off the table, so you don't even consider the other guys. So I ran home real quick. I told my wife where we were at. We decided we're going out to dinner. By the time we got to the restaurant, that number had broken 400,000. By the time we left dinner, like we were at, I think around 800,000. By the time the night was over, we had a film and TV deal, and a 7-figure deal for the book with multiple publishers and producers and stuff involved. Like it completely flipped, inside of a couple of hours. And, like the day before, like I was wondering if this book is even going to sell. So this industry is just crazy. You just never know.
So, wow, sort of every writer's dream, right? To have that sort of thing happen. Let's rewind for a second though, because you self-published your first novel, Forsaken, right? And what made you decide? So you had written multiple best-selling novels that didn't have your name on it. So you already knew that you're a great writer, that people love your stories. But so what made you, instead of going to agents with your first novel, decide to self-publish it?
Honestly, it was because I had no clue how to query an agent. I went through the process, but what I did, and this is completely wrong, I bought a list of agents, with their contact information. I think there were like 200 of them on there. I sent every single one the exact same email, literally to whom it may concern. I didn't even personalize it. I included the first 3 chapters of the book as a PDF, so I didn't look at any of their websites to see what they wanted, because some will say I want, a Word document, some want a PDF, some want Times New Roman, some want Arial. It has to be 12 point, not 10 point. Everybody's got their own little thing. I didn't look at any of that. So I just scattershot this out. And I didn't get a whole lot of responses back. And at the time I didn't know why I didn't get responses back. I didn't realize that I had done it wrong. So I took a step back and said, okay, well, I know I can indie publish this. I've been working in publishing for years, so I understand all the pieces. So I made a conscious decision to put the book out myself, but in a way that was on par with something coming out of Random House. Like that was my measuring stick. So I hired professionals across the board for the cover, for formatting, for editing. Ultimately, I released it as a hardcover, ebook, and an audiobook all on the same day, basically following the same model that they would. Paperback was set to come out 6 months later. I did it all through an LLC so that it looked like a corporation was behind it, not, some guy working out of his kitchen. And that worked. That got the book out there. It's not what lit up sales, though. I've got a very weird story regarding that. So in the book, I had to explain where the wife buys a journal. And just to get the book done, I wrote that she walked into Needful Things, Stephen King's store, and bought it there, which is, not something you can just do without a bunch of lawyers, knocking on your door. And I fully intended to change it, but my wife read it and she said, before we change it, let's see if we can get King's permission to use it. So we started brainstorming. How do you get Stephen King's permission to do anything?
Right.
Turned out he had a house in Florida that was about 10 minutes from my mom's house. So we went down there to visit. We printed up the manuscript. We hopped in the rental car and figured, well, we'll head over to Steve's house. We'll catch him outside gardening. I'll hand him the manuscript. He'll give us a big thumbs up and we'll be on our way by lunch. It didn't work out that way. So he lives on a little island off the coast. And like if you make a left, you go over a tiny bridge, you make a left, you go to the public portion of this island. So the bars, restaurants and stuff. If you make a right, it's like the entire half of this island that Stephen King owns. There's immediately a private drive sign, a no trespassing sign. There was a gate and then another gate. We got about halfway down this road and I realized this is a really bad idea. So we turned around, we went to a restaurant and I called a friend of mine who knew King, told him what we were doing. And he said, oh yeah, don't stalk Steve. He hates that. Here's his email address. Just send him the book. If he likes it, you'll hear back from him. If the book is terrible, he probably won't reply. So I sent him off the book and a couple of days later, I got an email back from King and he said, I love the reference. Go ahead and use it. Let me know if you need anything. I figured that was going to be enough to really spark the sales on the book, but the problem was nobody knew about any of that. So I hired a friend of mine that I used to work with years ago in PR. She did PR for rock bands out in LA during the hair band days. And I asked her if she wanted to work a book. And we started brainstorming, well, what can we do to drum up press on this? And I told her about this, essentially a failed trip to Stephen King's house. And she said, you know what, that's the story. Let's write that up. So she wrote up this story about an author who writes his first book and attempts to get to Stephen King to get his permission. And that when that story came out, librarians read it, bookstore owners read it, and then they started stocking the book. And then from there, it kind of spread. I think, there's two morals there, I guess. I think with any book you write these days, you have to write a 5-star book. I think it has to be the kind of book where somebody reads it and they're going to turn around and tell 3 other friends about it. Because you need that word of mouth to sell titles in any meaningful number. And the second moral is, just always examine what's going on, because, I could have easily walked away from all of that thinking that it just didn't work. But instead, we basically took a failed trip to somebody's house, turned it into a PR thing. We made something out of nothing. They created enough noise to ignite that fire. And I've been doing that sort of thing ever since. Every time I've got a book coming out, I look at what everybody else is doing to promote their titles, then I come up with things that nobody's doing. And that's what I tend to focus on. And it always seems to work.
That's absolutely amazing. Was there ever a point when you were like getting ready to, so I have to preface this by saying anyone who knows me knows that Stephen King is my favorite author, and I utterly worship the ground he walks on. So was there ever a moment when you were getting ready to send this off to Stephen King where you were thinking, well, wait, what if he tells me it sucks? Or even if he doesn't respond, that means it's terrible, right? Like, did you have that nervousness, or were you just really focused on...
That always hits. And my wife says that I'm fearless. I'm autistic. So to a certain extent, I don't feel that kind of fear. I think that a quote unquote normal person probably would. I'm more afraid of, like what would happen if I don't ask the question? I would much rather hear no from somebody than not ask the question at all and spend the rest of my life wondering. So honestly, like when I sent it off, I expected to not hear anything back. He probably gets a gazillion emails a day, or whatever. Like, why would he reply to me? But he's been one of those guys, like over the years, I've hit him up a few times with for advice on the industry and things like that. And he's always there. And I've got a number of big name authors that I work with these days, or that I know, and they all tend to be that. I like that. And I think it's because they all remember what it was like to be that debut author, writing that first book that nobody, you haven't sold yet. And like, it's so fresh in their memory. They're all willing to pay it forward a little bit.
That's really amazing. And it's so nice to hear that authors that you love are actually really awesome people in reality. So that's really cool to hear that he would just read it and let you use the names of, needful things. That's amazing. I love that.
Well, he's probably kicking himself now because I've been milking that story for 11 years, but I am totally grateful.
That's a good story. That's a great one. So what does your writing practice look like now? Like, what is a typical writing day for you?
Well, now I'm doing this full time. I've been full time for 11 years now. So I've got it pretty dialed in. I get up at the crack of 7 in the morning. I told myself when I left the corporate world, I'd never set an alarm before 7.
Good for you.
So I get up, I go to the kitchen, say, hello to my wife and daughter. Then I grab a cup of coffee, head straight into my office. I turn the internet off like first thing in the morning, mainly because I don't want the distraction. So I just hit the ground and just start, working on my words. And I shoot for like 2,000 to 3,000 words every day. And I usually get that done around 10:30 or 11. Then I flip the switch for the internet. Then my inbox fills up with the whole business side of this, because in today's world, I'm in about 150 different countries and a couple dozen languages. So I've got a lot of publishers and people that I deal with, on a worldwide basis. So then I work through that, take lunch around 12, and then from 12:30 until 3 o'clock, I do things like this. I talk to other people. I do podcasts. I do interviews. Basically, just continue dealing with the business side of things. 3 o'clock is my quitting bell. I live on a little island now in New England, off the coast of Portsmouth, and I do a lap around the island every day. I go for a run. It's a little over 4 miles or so. I just kind of use that time to think about what I'm going to work on the next day, get my head on straight, come home, work out in our gym for a little bit, and then I spend the rest of the night with my wife and daughter and just have family time and just repeat. One of the things that hit me hard when I first started selling a lot of books, I started getting picked up in these foreign territories, and I would get interview requests at all kinds of crazy hours, and I would do them. I would get up at 2 o'clock in the morning to do this interview somewhere, on the other side of the world. Yeah. And, I quickly realized that just wasn't sustainable. Like, I physically could not keep doing that. So now I have this, little window where I allow people to schedule interviews, and I try to keep everybody within that. And that seems to work pretty well.
Yeah. And that makes sense. I think sometimes people will forget, like when, that they have a life that they're balancing in the midst of their success, and that success is great, but usually the whole purpose we want that success for is so we have a balance in our lives that works and that feels really comfortable. So it sounds like you've achieved that.
Yeah, well, I've got writer friends that are the opposite of that. They get up first thing in the morning, they head straight to their office, and like their wife slides some pizza under their door, for dinner, like, and they don't see anybody.
Oh, no.
And these are the person I'm talking about is a very, very big name author. I don't want to throw him under the bus.
Yeah.
But like he lives for writing, for the words. And I had to have a balance. I've got an 8-year-old daughter. My dad wasn't around a whole lot when I was growing up. He worked construction. So like he left first thing in the morning. He was, by the time he was getting home, we're heading off to bed, so I barely saw him, and I didn't want to be that guy. So I'm here every day for my daughter and my wife. And to me, that's the most important thing. I mean, the rest of the stuff is just gravy.
I love that perspective. And you said that you work on your actual writing from somewhere around like 7 till maybe 10:30 or 11. So is it really just that you're writing for a specific amount of time, or is there a word count or any other external thing that you're like, that's indicating success for that day?
Usually 2,000 to 3,000 words is my sweet spot. I can go beyond that, but then I find that the next day I end up cutting a lot of it. Like you can only squeeze so much water out of that rock.
Yeah.
And I've figured out what that number is over the years. I mean, initially it wasn't like that. When I was in the corporate world, I would squeeze out words whenever I could. And I was lucky if I got 200 to 300 a day. But I would tell myself that's a page a day. That's a novel within a year. And as long as you look at it in these small little chunks, it seems very obtainable. Writing to me is very much like going to the gym. Like if you do it every day, it gets easier. Like you can lift a little bit more, you can lift a little bit longer. Writing is the same thing. If you write 200 words today, tomorrow you might be able to do 215. The next day you might do 230. But as long as you do it every day, it gets easier and that word count can go up.
Yeah, I really love it. It's so true. I find whenever I skip a day of writing, one day tends to turn into more than one day is the problem. And then you're out of the habit. And it is harder. It's like anything else. It is just harder to sit back down and to remember where you are in the story and to be kind of back in the same vibe. But I also heard on one of your other interviews somewhere that you have a system where you have like headphones and you listen to thunderstorm sounds. Do you do that? And if
so again, back, a lot of this stems from, trying to write while I was in the corporate world, because I was working 60 to 80 hours a week, like trying to find time to write. Like I didn't want to be the guy who just wrote, every third Saturday or when the moon was full or whatever. Yeah. Like I knew I needed to do it every day in order for it to work. I listened to a thunderstorm soundtrack, white noise. And what I find is it's like a Pavlov's dog thing. As soon as my brain hears that sound, it knows that it's time to write. I've learned that it's best to try to write in the same place every day. If you can do it at the same time every day, that's helpful. Anything like that basically, tells your mind, this is what we're doing right here, right now. And that works for me. I've got friends who, they prefer to go to a different coffee shop every day and they need people around them. Like I couldn't do that, but that works for them. So, we were talking before you hit the record button. I've got a podcast called Writers Inc., where we've interviewed literally every big name author out there. I think we're on episode 400 or something now. We always get their origin story. We always get their process. And like after 400 episodes, we still haven't heard 2 that are the same. Like literally every author has a completely different process and origin story, which is crazy considering all we're doing is, literally making shit up on a daily basis.
It's so true. But I think it's so helpful for writers to hear about all the different types of processes that are working for people. And then maybe somewhere in the midst of that, they can hear something that helps them cobble together their own process and like, oh, and when I heard that you listened to the thunderstorm sounds, I go, oh, that's so interesting because I will always listen to dark academia. My daughter makes fun of me all the time because, she's 15 and I'm listening to dark academia to write, as I write. But I think that is so true that it's sort of whatever it is you're doing, whatever process, it can really help you just get in the mood to write and make the words flow more easily.
That's what's cool about podcasts like this, because somebody could be listening and they're going to hear something they haven't tried yet, and hopefully they try it, and it may work for them, it may not. But I'm always trying new things. Like I don't know if you can see it, but there's a typewriter on the shelf behind me there. I've got a book where I write one sentence on that typewriter every day when I walk into my office. And I've got another one that I'm writing out by hand on a notepad. And like what I find is that my voice is different when I change the medium a little bit. That sounds very much like a detective noir story from the 50s. The handwritten one is a very personal, like one, first person, narrative. It's odd, but like when you change things up like that, your voice is different. You come up with a unique story. I think it keeps it fun too, because it keeps it interesting. I think honestly, like the day I stop trying new things is probably the day I retire.
Yeah, that makes sense. I love that you're writing by hand and by typewriter, and I'm assuming by computer as well, and that it's sounding different. I've never tried that. When I was much younger, when 15 and, reading all those Stephen King novels and determined that that's what I wanted to do. I remember I wrote everything by hand at first because I didn't have any other way. And then my mother bought me this old, or it was new then, it's old now, this Brother typewriter. And I don't know, I think we're probably of a similar age, but do you remember the whiteout strips
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And they were expensive too. So it was really hard and really expensive to make a mistake.
Yeah. Whiteout was actually invented by the mother of one of the guys in the Monkees, if you remember that band.
What? Really?
Yeah, my brain is full of useless trivia.
I feel that is not useless at all. I feel like that is so important to know. I love that. So how long does it actually take you to write a novel now?
I'm pretty quick now. I could knock one out in about 3 or 4 months. Nice. But it depends a lot on the story. Like this one behind me, it's my latest. It's called Something I Keep Upstairs. It's a haunted house story, but the house in the story is real. It exists in a little island right off the coast of the island where I live. So I incorporated a lot of real events in the story, and that really slowed me down. It took me about 4 years to write this book because I would learn some new crazy, interesting fact that I wanted to work into the story, and then I'd have to put it off to the side until I, figured out what I was going to do with it. I'd go and work on something else and come back to it. But that's the longest I've ever spent on a book. That was just a little over 4 years.
Oh, wow. And it's funny. I just got done reading that book for the first time. And first of all, I loved the title so much. Something I Keep Upstairs. I was like, wait, what?
Yeah. Well, what does he keep upstairs?
I know. And it's absolutely amazing. For anyone who hasn't read that book, it's so amazing. I loved every single moment of it. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you about with that book specifically, but all of your books in general, I noticed that there was so much backstory and world building. And I love that sort of thing. And so many writers are afraid of backstory, and they're afraid of putting too much on the page. But I remember reading this book, and I just got done with it. I was just like, oh my gosh, everywhere on every page is this beautiful, delicious backstory. And like all of the things, it's like this kid, like he's 17, right? And he's going around and he's telling you all about his town and everything he knows. And he's telling you about every character that he knows as he meets them. And it just feels so personal and so deep. And like I could really step into that world and those characters would be real. So how do you handle, do you ever worry you're putting too much, or have you just always had that sense of how much backstory can work in a novel?
Well, I worked as a book doctor for so many years, and not only for other authors, but at the end there, I was getting hired by agents. I was getting hired by editors in New York, to tweak books. So I was constantly getting feedback on what works and what doesn't work. When it comes to backstory, I tend to see a lot of authors make the mistake by front loading. So they'll spend the first chapter, the first 2 chapters, 3 chapters, just trying to establish their world and their characters. That to me never works. A lot of times when I ran into a book like that as a book doctor, I'd delete those first couple of chapters. I'd figure out where the real action starts. That would become the beginning of my book. And then I would look at whatever information was in those chapters I just cut and find some other place where I can sprinkle it in. And you had mentioned in this book, I do a lot of it, but it's always interspersed with the actual action of what's going on, because our brains, I think, are conditioned. If you give too much backstory, too much facts, too much information, we start to skim. And you don't want that. So, but if you hit them with dialogue, this is going on, this is happening, some real time event, and then you throw in a sentence or two or a paragraph on something that they need to know, then you go back to that, you basically keep them in the story the entire time. You have to keep them engaging. One of the ways that I work that out in my own writing, since your listeners are writers, we can go into the weeds a little bit. I use a ton of beta readers, and I give them all printed copies of my books. And two of the instructions that they get is I want to know where they're closing the book, where they feel it's okay to put it down. And I don't care if it's because they got to pick up the kids from school or they got to make dinner or they got to go to work. I don't care what the reason is. I just want to know where they felt it was okay to, to wrap, fold the corner of the page and put it down for a couple minutes. And the other thing I do is I tell them to highlight any place where they skim. And when I get all these beta copies back, I usually have about 6 to 8 of them. I'll just lay them all out on my desk. And if I see multiple people are skimming the same stuff, then, I address it on the rewrite. Because even, as an author, a lot of times you don't see it, and it's tough to determine, is this necessary for the story? You may feel that it is, a reader may feel that it's not. So I tend to depend on a lot of other people in order to help make those decisions.
Oh, I love that. That's such a great way to go about it, to go to the reader and have so many beta readers and see what is the same between beta readers and, what might be person specific. So once you go through the beta, I'm assuming that you write the manuscript, then you first go to your beta readers, and then from there you hand it over to an editor. And is that how that works for you?
I'll go through the whole process. So I'll basically come up with the idea for the book, and then I'll write the first chapter. Then I show that first chapter to my wife, and she basically tells me whether the story is worth pursuing or not. Because there are plenty that don't get past that first chapter stage. If she likes it, then I go back to my office. I don't show anybody anything until I get the first draft done to essentially the best of my ability. So I do a lot of tweaking. I tend to start the day by reading whatever I wrote the previous day and editing it and cleaning it up. So by the time I get to the end of that first draft, it's usually a pretty clean first draft. I've never really had to go back and do a rewrite.
Nice.
Once I go through that, I drop the whole thing into a website called AutoCrit. And there's a tab that they've got in there called Strong Writing. And when you click on that, it'll help you weed out, passive voice, filler words like the word just. I tend to use the word just a lot. And 99% of the time you can draw a line through it. It doesn't even need to be there. But AutoCrit helps me clean all that up. So I'll do that. So that's technically a second draft. Then the whole book goes to my wife. She's my alpha reader. She reads the entire book from start to finish. And she's learned over the years to be as critical as possible. I get it back from her. Then I do another edit on it. And then after that, it goes off to the beta readers and they do their thing. Then it comes back and it goes through copy edits and for grammar and punctuation. There's about 6 different rounds of edits before I send the book off to like my agent or my editor before the industry people start to see it.
Oh, that's amazing. And sort of going back to what you said is you're always trying to make sure it is in its best form. Like it could be picked up, like even if you weren't as successful as you are now, it could stand on its own. Even I'm assuming before it gets to the editors, which is amazing. It's probably why the books are so incredibly strong.
Well, one of the things that I learned just, working with editors when I was, basically a hired gun to fix stuff, if you went back 10 or 15 years, they had the budget to do that. They could hire people like me. So if they, brought in a book that they liked that needed work, that was perfectly okay. Today's world, they don't have that anymore. They don't have the luxury of, being able to spend money to fix a book. They don't have the time to work with an author to fix it themselves. So most of the time, if you can turn in a book that is, literally a 5-star read with very few errors, something they can just put on the publication pipeline and step away without any real work, they're going to pay top dollar for that. And not only will they pay top dollar, but the marketing people will be all over it. So just kind of, it goes right down the line. You're creating a product at the end of the day. So you want to turn in, the absolute best product you can. I see so many people that make the mistake of turning something in. They try to shop it too early. They'll get rejections from agents, so they decide to just indie publish it instead. But they don't take the time to realize, to figure out why those agents were rejecting it. A lot of times things can be fixed, but if you don't do it, you just put the book out there. It exists now in the world with those problems, and that can hurt you too. There's so many landmines you can step on.
For sure. And do you find now that for writers who are being published today as a debut that it sort of makes sense for them to get a professional editor to look at, to hire a developmental editor or something like that before they ever try to send it off to an agent? Is that something that you see being much more common now?
Absolutely. I think it's a complete requirement.
Yeah.
What I see a lot of people do is, unfortunately, they spend a lot of time, working on the first, second, and third chapter. Because that's what agents want to see. Most agents want to see 1 chapter. They want to see 3 chapters, but they end up tweaking those 3 chapters over and over. So like that part is done. That part's gold. But then you get to chapter 4 and all of a sudden you start running into all the things that they fixed in the other part and didn't bother to fix in the rest. Like that whole book needs to be, it sucks, but it's got to be a perfect book by the time it leaves your desk or as close to it as you can get it. Because that's what you're competing against.
So true. And I think that so many writers aren't truly understanding that the publishing world has changed. It used to be many, many years ago, you could give a book that needed a lot of work to an agent and they would work with you. And, you had all that editorial support on that end. And it's just really not like that anymore, sadly.
No, that's gone away.
Yeah. So I heard that you used to be a pantser, but now you are a reformed plotter. Can you take us through that journey? Because that's an interesting one.
this is James Patterson's fault. So we were talking Stephen King earlier. I've got all these books behind me. There's only one book back there on craft, and it's on writing by Stephen King. It's probably my favorite book on the actual craft of writing. But one of the things that he mentions in there is, he pantses all of his novels. He comes up with his plot. He comes up with his characters. He drops these people into some kind of, crazy situation. He just lets it play out on paper. He's got no idea where it's going. And he feels that if he doesn't know, the reader's not going to figure out, and that makes perfect sense to me. So the first couple books I wrote, that's exactly what I did. When Fourth Monkey was coming out, the publisher at the time was HMH, which is part of HarperCollins now. They sent ARC copies, advanced reader copies, off to all these big name authors, hoping to get a quote for the cover of the book to help sell it. James Patterson happened to get one of those copies of the Fourth Monkey, and he called me up after he read it. And it was funny. I was sitting at my desk and I get this phone call from Palm Beach, and I used to live in Florida, so I knew the area code. I pick it up, and he's like, "It's Jim Patterson. You got a second?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure it is." I'm thinking it's one of my buddies pranking me or something.
Right.
But he starts talking about the book, and a couple minutes in, I realized this might actually be him. And we talked about that book for a little bit. We talked about other books, and then we made some plans to get together for lunch the next time I was down in Florida. So we met for lunch, and he showed up. He had a folder like an inch thick on me, like he knew all about the book doctor work I had done, my entire history, like a whole dossier. Like I have no clue where he got that from. But we started talking, and I was a pantser, and he is a notorious outliner. He creates 30 to 50 pages of an outline before he actually starts writing the book. Obviously, two very different camps, so we didn't think we'd be able to work together. So I left that lunch thinking I just had lunch with James Patterson. That's a win, and kind of wrote it off. Then we talked a couple of months later, and he's like, "You know what? Let's try it your way. Let's try to pants a novel." So I would, we went back and forth. I would write a chapter and paint him into some kind of crazy, impossible scenario, send him the pages thinking there's no way he's going to get out of this. And, 15 minutes later, he'd send me new pages. And not only did he write his way out of it, but he put me in an even worse position. And we went back and forth through the whole book like that. It's called The Coast to Coast Murders. It's the twistiest book I think I've ever written, because it's literally me and James Patterson trying to, trap each other.
That's hilarious.
But we finished it up, and, we ended up with, I think, 160,000 words in the book. We ended up cutting like 40,000 words to clean it all up. That's a lot of words on the cutting room floor. We finished it, and he's like, "You know what? We tried it your way. I want you to try something my way. So here's an outline." And he gave me an outline for a book called The Noise. And we wrote that one. And honestly, it went so fast and it was so seamless. And I knew where the story was going. So I was just able to spend more time on it. He brought me over to the outlining camp. I've been outlining ever since. And I think what it really comes down to is, I mentioned I go for a run every day. It's about an hour. And when I was pantsing novels, I would always use that time to figure out, what comes next in the story, what comes next. So I, wouldn't stare at a blank screen the next day. But now I know what comes next. So I can use that same brain power to figure out how do I make what comes next better. And I can tweak it. One of the things that he taught me on the outlining front, because I had tried outlining before, and outlines to me always felt very static. And, I would write the outline. I have the whole book outlined. I'd get maybe one or two chapters into it. Then I would come up with some crazy idea, and then I would go off in this direction, and the outline was over here. Before you knew it, the outline was meaningless. It didn't matter anymore. What he actually taught me to do is, create a dynamic outline. So you can still come up with those ideas, but when you come up with the idea, then you go through the outline and work it through, update the outline to match it. So your outline is always changing as you're writing, but it's basically improving. And by doing that, it's honestly, it's been way more productive for me.
I love that idea. Yeah. Whenever I'm working with a writer on their work, we always do outlines, almost always, unless it's a diehard pantser, in which case I silently cry on the inside. But, and that the idea that it's this living, breathing document, and it's not telling you what absolutely has to happen, but it's giving you a container in which you write and that can be changed. So I love that idea. Right. So if you're outlining, do you have any particular, I know there are so many story structure methods out there. Is there one that you particularly use, or is it something that James Patterson came up with and you inherited? I'm thinking the story, the Save the Cat or the hero's journey or anything like that.
You can definitely use those. I recommend Save the Cat to people all the time. I grew up without a TV in the house, and this was the 70s, so it doesn't mean much. There was only 3 channels, and there was nothing worth watching anyway. But we hit the library all the time, and I was reading at a very young age. I moved on. I read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drews, and moved on and read all the classics and stuff. And I think I've been reading for so long, the actual structure of a story is just embedded in my head. So when I'm writing or even when I'm reading, I intrinsically know twist needs to happen here. Climax needs to start here. This needs to happen here. Like all these things feel almost like I'm on a road trip. And if I skip one of them, it's almost like I just missed my turn. And like I have to throw the car in reverse and go back, edit the last couple thousand words and go back to wherever I screwed up and continue there. But like, I know where those goalposts are. And it's funny because people have taken my book since then and, like they fit perfectly in a 3-act structure.
Yeah.
So like that framework is there because it's in every other story, all going all the way back to Shakespeare. But, like I've never actually formally studied it other than the reading. So I guess the moral of this is if you read a ton, you're probably going to understand how a story should be structured. If you don't read a ton, you should be reading a ton if you want to become an author, but you can use something like Save the Cat to help you with that framework.
Yeah, I love that. I love the idea that eventually it all just, no matter if you study it directly and, you set out to, save the cat and read all of that, or whether you're just studying stories, that eventually all of the beats, all of the big things that need to happen sort of, it's kind of like, I know that a house would need a roof and it needs a front door and it needs a floor and it needs studs in there, right? And it's kind of the same thing with story. Like you intuitively begin to know what things fit into that and what needs to be there to hold the whole thing up.
I used to write a lot of computer code when I was younger. And like when you write the first line of a program, you have to understand how it's going to impact the last line. And to me, writing a book is very similar to that. So even when I was pantsing a novel, I always knew what my beginning would be. I always had an idea for 1 or 2 things that would happen in the middle, but I definitely had an ending in mind. And that ending may change, but it allowed my brain to have some kind of destination. So the story was always working towards whatever that ending is. Because I saw a ton of books when I was working as a book doctor where, some of them were like literally 400,000 words long. Somebody had been writing it for years and years and years. And like there was no endpoint in sight. They had some great characters, but it was like almost like a soap opera where you're watching those characters all the time. And like there's no ending to that particular story. So I think it's important to have an ending. Again, it can always change, but just have that ending in mind. So your brain subconsciously is working towards it.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's great to have some place to be aiming for so that, again, it's like building a container, a boundary, like something that you're working towards so that it's not, I think one of the hardest things for many writers, especially new writers, is when they sit down to write a book, anything is possible. It's about narrowing the options. It's like, well, maybe not anything is possible because I know I'm trying to get to this place. This is the destination. So maybe we're not going way over there. So how detailed are your outlines now? Do you do what James Patterson did and write 30 to 40 pages of outlines, or is it much smaller?
No, that's kind of where I'm at. I do 2 to 3 sentences for each chapter. Sometimes I'll throw a little bit of dialogue in there if I have something in mind that I want to have in the story at a certain spot. But I try not to go overboard. I don't want them to be too long. But just enough, so that I know, which beat is happening where. It allows me to shuffle stuff around. A lot of times I have stories that, they have different timelines going on, like a present and past kind of thing. If you've got an outline, it's very easy to move those things and figure out what works where. I think everybody needs to decide what works best for them. I've seen people that do, 1-word outlines, one word for each chapter, just something to keep them on task. I've seen other people that do pages and pages. Jeffrey Deaver does, I think he does like 80-page outlines.
Ooh,
but it works for him.
That's nice. And so when you are thinking about scene structure, so if you're writing a couple of sentences per scene, do you automatically know sort of the structure of the scene that you want to write, or is there a particular structure that just comes naturally to you, or do you know what I'm saying there? Like, are you writing
for the most part, I'm pretty vague when it comes to that stuff on the outlining side. But I make sure I dial it in when I actually write. A couple of things that I do, I use Scrivener to write most of my books. And I start each chapter by putting, the name of the point of view character. Sam is the POV or whatever. So Sam's name would come first. And then I timestamp it. I always put a date and timestamp. And it may not, end up in the final book, but it's important for me to know that this is happening at 7:13 in the morning, or this is happening at 10 o'clock at night. And it helps you catch little things. Like if your characters get on a plane and go to LA, you need to make sure that takes 6 hours. And if you have these timestamps there, you can account for all that. Make sure you include bathroom breaks. Like people don't do that. A lot of characters don't eat. It's like they're real people, so you have to try and work all this stuff in there. Outlining helps because you can see this whole story takes place over 5 days. They need to sleep at least 4 or 5 times. You can make sure everything's included. I think when you do it the proper way.
Oh, I really love that. Yeah. That idea of keeping the natural rhythm of what it means to be a human, which can sometimes slip away when you're so focused on the story. If you're not thinking about the timing of things, that's really neat. So you were talking about characters, and your characters are so incredibly real. Again, I just got done reading something I keep upstairs, and I feel like I could run into those characters anyway. I feel like I could run into them. They're so real. So what do you do as far as character development? Do they just come naturally to you, or do you have a system or a process that you go through to develop them?
I'm pretty extensive. Like, to me, they need to feel like real people before I actually start writing. So like, I know everything about them. So in my 4MK series, my lead detective is named Sam Porter. And I could tell, like, if I took him to Disney World, I could drop him at the entrance and I could tell you what ride he's going to go on first. I could tell you what he's going to eat for lunch. I know his high school girlfriend's name. I know his favorite song. Like, none of this stuff will ever end up in a book, but like, these are things that I know about my real life best friend. So they're things that I need to know about my characters. One of the things that I've been doing lately, I've been using AI to generate images. So I'll create a character sketch, like their their personality, all their traits, everything that I decide that they need to be. And I'll drop that into the AI and have it create an actual image of that person. And I've got a board in my office where I post all those images so I can look up and I can see this particular character. And to me, that helps make them a little bit more real. I'll do that with locations too. I just wrote a book where it largely takes place in a cabin in the woods. So I laid out the cabin on paper and stuff. And then I used AI to actually create a physical image of that cabin from the inside, from the outside, just to get simple things right. Like, you walk through the front door and the kitchen is on the left and the bathroom's on the right. Like, you want to make sure you're consistent with all that kind of thing.
Oh, that's so fun. I know whenever I'm writing, what I'll do, I'd never thought of using AI for that, honestly, but I'll always like pick actors or famous people that will be standing for the characters so I can start to see how they move and how, whatever, or find houses online. And I'm like, oh, it's kind of like this, again, to see that. But using AI, that's amazing. I love that idea.
Using actors and actresses, that's actually a great new way to approach it too. I mean, because you're basically starting from something. And I used to do that all the time. So I would take an actor like Ben Affleck and just say, okay, my main character is like Ben Affleck, because like, what he looks like, how he moves, how he sounds, his vocal patterns. And it gives you a good jumping off point. And I think even when you start with famous people like that, you'll get to a certain point in the story where your characters basically become their own character.
Yeah.
And then all you have to do is go back and adjust that first half to match whatever you have in the second half.
I love that so much. So in your novels, you tend to, so you write like thrillers, chillers with speculative horror stuff mixed in there. How do you handle so especially if we're talking about thrillers, I know in the book that I just read of yours, there was a lot of mystery, a lot of stuff that we had to figure out as we went. How do you handle that push-pull of how much to give the reader and how much to hold back?
A lot of it is just practice. And a lot of times I'll move things. I may reveal something on page 35 and then I may decide later that it's better on page 108, so I'll just do a quick copy and paste and shuffle something over. It's one of those things I think you just kind of learn how to do with time.
Yeah. Were there any authors that you studied who helped you figure out how to how to give that information, how to parse it out over time?
With creating characters, I studied Stephen King quite a bit. When I used to teach other authors, I would tell them to pick up like a collection of short stories. So pick up Skeleton Crew or one of his books on short stories. Then go through each short story and highlight any place where he introduces a new character. Because King is very good at creating a full person in like 2 or 3 sentences. And he usually gives them just, 1 or 2 traits, to make them stand out. But like the way he, throws that out there is very specific and it's very effective. So I've studied that quite a bit.
Yeah, no, that's so true. Find an author who is really good at doing a particular thing and then, study them for that. And I would argue that you are also very good at that exact thing. That is something that when I was reading this, I'm like, oh my gosh, these characters are so real.
It comes from practice. I mean, even the thriller stuff. I mean, I've been lucky enough to write with James Patterson. I think we're on book 6 or 7 or something now. If you've ever taken his masterclass online, like writing with him is very much like taking the masterclass, except he calls you and tells you everything you're doing wrong. And like when somebody like James Patterson tells you you're doing something wrong enough times, you end up fixing it. So he's influenced my writing style tremendously over the years.
That's awesome. So what I'm hearing is that everyone should go out and buy that master class and
take that master. It's one of my favorite ones.
That's amazing.
Dan Brown lives down the street from me too, and his master class is fantastic.
Very, very cool. So when you first started, and I kind of want to rewind to a little bit of the writing process for just a second. When you start out writing a book, I think that you said that you write the tagline on the blurb first. And can you tell me a little bit about that? Do you have like a formula for writing those things, or is it just whatever sounds good to you in the moment?
Yeah, there's no real formula. So on my phone, I use a program called Simple Note, which is just a note-taking app. And I've literally got one note called ideas. So anytime I get some kind of off the wall, this might work in a book, I drop it in there.
Yeah.
And what I typically find is like 2 or 3 of them have to come together in order to create a book. So like with something I keep upstairs, I had the tagline for the book, which is for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. Like I had that tagline for years. And I knew I wanted to write a haunted house book, but I didn't want to write the same haunted house book that we had seen over and over. Husband and wife buy a house, they move in, something weird happens, something weirder happens. They do some research, realize something really bad happened, and then they've got to fix it. And either everybody dies or they come out and the sun is shining at the end. But like, it's that same story that we've heard over and over. So I got to thinking, what would it take to actually make a haunted house? So that's the basis of this story. And in this story, it's a 17-year-old kid. His grandmother passes away and she leaves him a house with a lot of money. And it's on a private island, and he does exactly what you would expect. He turns it into a party house for him and his friends. And just someplace they can get away from the parents, from the police, and kind of have fun that last summer before they all go off to college. But partying gets old after a little while, and somebody raises their hand and says, hey, what would it take to turn this into a haunted house? And they start exactly where you would expect. There's a couple of scary stories. There's a Ouija board, but the tagline for the book, for a haunted house to be born, somebody has to die. So you know where they're going. So like that was a couple different things that came together. But honestly, it was like having that tagline and then seeing the real house in real life, I think is what actually did it for me. Because when the first time I saw that house, the one that I based the book on, I knew that was the house, and then that kind of spurred everything else. So the two things had to come together. Like if I hadn't already had the tagline and I just saw the house, it probably wouldn't have worked, or vice versa. Yeah. You just never know. I mean, another one is I had a book called Behind a Closed Door. And I had a husband and wife character that they were in my note app forever. I knew I wanted to write about these two. They've been married for about 10 years, but their marriage is getting a little stale, not because they don't love each other, but because they're, living very separate lives. They both work. They hardly see each other. They watch Netflix for maybe 20 minutes every night, fall asleep and go back to work. And, so rinse and repeat. But at the beginning of the story, I knew I wanted the husband to come really close to cheating, but it doesn't actually happen. He stops himself. So that's basically, I had that in that note app forever. And then one day my wife and I were talking over dinner, and she does a lot of real estate. She had just bought a house in Georgia that needed a renovation. And it had 7 bathrooms in it. So we were just discussing, like, how do we deal with 7 bathrooms? And I brought up this company called Bath Fitters. They come in one day and they do a retrofit on your bathroom. We've all seen the commercials. I didn't type that into anything. We literally just talked about it. And that night on our phones and on TV, we started seeing all these commercials for Bath Fitters. It was on our social media feeds. So I started to research this and learned that in the terms of service for our phones, we actually give them the ability to listen to our conversations 24/7. So my phone is listening to me right now. It's grabbing keywords out of the air, and it's going to use those keywords to target market later. So that was a totally different, tech sci-fi kind of idea, but I took the two and put them together. So we go back to my husband and wife character. I start the book with them in therapy, and their therapist recommends that they download this app called Sugar and Spice to rekindle their marriage. And by downloading this app to their phone, a lot of bad things happen. Basically, it's truth or dare for adults. It starts off with fairly benign things, but at one point the wife gets a message that says, would you kill a total stranger to save somebody you love? Our best friend clicks yes on it, thinking that it's a joke, and a map comes up with a pin and a timer. And things get crazier from there. But it was just a marriage of these two different ideas. I had my husband and wife over here. I didn't know what I was going to do with them. Then I had this conversation with my wife, and that tech stuff came into focus. Then I put them both together, and sort of like chocolate and peanut butter, it works.
I love that. I love the idea that book was built out of not only the what if, but then the characters at the same time. Like there was the two things coming together to make it something that worked, instead of just starting with character or just starting with premise. You kind of had to wait for the two to arrive.
But all the books that I've written, I think I've got 19 now. I don't think any one or two have come together the same way. Like it's always been something different.
So you have spoken openly about being an author who is autistic. Can you explain how you think that has contributed to your creativity, your writing, and your ability to think in ways that might be different than people who are not autistic and out there writing?
Yes, I was diagnosed at 22 with something called Asperger's syndrome, which today you're just on the spectrum somewhere. I don't think they give it a name. But, I learned very early on that I'm very good with patterns. So we had talked about like the story structure of a book. Like I see that pattern when I read a book. I see it when I watch a movie. I recognize all that. So I think that's big, because I can basically plot out a book in my head. Like I don't necessarily, like you can't see my desk, but there's no notes on my desk. It's all up here. So there's that. And one of the other things that I learned early on is as an autistic person, I tend to mimic other people, particularly like in a social situation. So if I'm at a party and somebody cracks a joke, I'm going to laugh because the people around me are laughing, not necessarily because I find it funny, but it's my brain doing its little thing to try and fit in with everybody else. I learned years ago that I could mimic people on paper. So if you were to give me something written by somebody else, I can read that and pick up on the vocabulary, the writing style, the cadence, and basically mimic their voice on paper and continue that story. So I've used that over the years. So I've kind of doubled down on the stuff that autism has brought me, from a positive standpoint. And I've spent, 30 years trying to weed out the few negatives that it's brought me to. It's always this battle going on, but the positives have always outweighed the negatives.
I love that. I love the idea that you're bringing the idea of your incredible pattern recognition. And also, I'm assuming that being able to mimic people's style really helped with that ghostwriting and with matching your writing to if you're writing with someone else like James Patterson or whatnot.
Yeah, and it helped quite a bit with that. I used to write a lot of memoirs for other people, sports figures, actors, actresses, politicians. So if I had to write a book that was, from a woman's point of view in first person, I could sit down and I could do that. I could mimic the person that I was supposed to be. I think a lot of that, because I did so many memoirs, it helped me with characters later on to basically get into the head of that character and become that person on paper.
Absolutely. I can imagine, especially if you can capture a voice that well in memoir that people who are out there reading it are believing that someone else wrote it, it's from their perspective. That's an incredibly difficult task, but that's an amazing thing to understand that pattern recognition has been so beneficial in making you as successful as you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you encourage writers to think differently. And when you say that, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to think differently as a writer? What should we be doing?
Well, I see a lot of authors that, they look to everybody else to figure out what they should do. All these other authors, let's say, are doing Facebook ads, they're doing Amazon ads, they're doing all these different things to promote their book. So that's what I'm going to do to promote my book. And that works to a certain extent. But the problem is you're never going to get ahead of that particular group because you're always chasing that group. You're always following that group. So you need to do something different. To give you an example, so the haunted house story behind me, I mentioned that was based on a real house. The house actually exists. So for promo for the book, we actually gave an overnight stay away to one person in the actual haunted house. So from a press standpoint, that was huge because I was on television, I was on radio, everybody wanted to talk to this author who was giving away an overnight stay in a haunted house to promote his book. That didn't cost me anything, that was basically, but it created a ton of word of mouth. If you went on social media, everybody was like, I'll do it. Will you do it? I won't do it if you do it. I'll do it if you do it. Like everybody was just chatting about it and, all the press was all over it. And we got to milk that honestly for a couple of months because, from the moment we first talked about it until the book actually came out, until the person won the contest, then it rekindled it again. But all of that was free press. And, to this day, I don't know of another author who's actually done that. So whenever I've got a book coming out, I try to come up with something unique that nobody is doing.
I love the way you're using stories essentially to sell stories. You're like the idea of you trying to catch up with Stephen King and have him read your book, or this idea of staying in the haunted house that's the haunted house in your book. It's like telling a story to the public that people want to talk about in order to sell the books that you're selling. So I think that's really neat.
Well, at the end of the day, we're selling widgets, and every widget that is sold with some type of story or a jingle. Sometimes there's a cool jingle.
That's true. And so I just have to ask you one question about that. So that often, writers will be thinking that, it is just a widget, right? So does that mean that when you're coming up with stories that you're always thinking, what are the scenes that have to be in this story, or what are your obligatory scenes? What are all of that? Or do you come at story from a different angle than that?
Well, I think if a scene feels like it has to be in the book, if that feeling is coming to you because you've seen that somewhere else, then you need to make sure it's not in the book. Like if the character feels like they should do this, I always try to make them do that. Something different. Because if you expect that to happen, if you think that that's the next thing that's going to happen, chances are the reader does too. And you don't want to fulfill that wish. You want to jerk them in a completely different direction.
If you could give one piece of advice to writers out there, what would it be before we go?
Just write every day and don't give up. I think it was Patterson that told me hope is not a strategy. You have to have an actual strategy, and that is so true.
I love that so much. Well, JD, thank you so much for being on the show today. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our listeners will learn so much as well.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Okay, my friends, that's it for today. If you haven't done so already, please click the link in the show notes to get on my email list. Why? Because if you're on my email list, you'll hear about all my upcoming free and paid classes. Plus, you'll be able to sign up for any free writing sprints that I do this year. So honestly, my email list is a great place to be, and I know you're going to love the stuff I give you. So go ahead on down there to the show notes and get on my email list so you can get all the fun goodies that I want to share with you. Until next time, keep writing, keep dreaming, and remember, the world needs your stories right now. So don't you dare give up on your novel or yourself. Talk soon.